Hello, everyone, and welcome to History with Mr. E. Today, we're going to talk about the Pacific Theater of World War II from 1942 to 1945. This is going to be for Chapter 27.5. The first half of the war did not go well in the Pacific for the Allies, especially for the United States. Three U.S. outposts existed between Hawaii as the far western outpost for the United States and the Philippines, which the United States controlled after the Spanish-American War and for another several years. Those three outposts were Midway Island, Wake Island, and Guam Island, and they were typically used for military outposts and recoaling stations before the war. Guam fell very quickly to the Japanese. Wake fell on December 23rd, 1941, after a heroic stand on the island, but the Japanese starved them out. They couldn't get supplies and eventually had to either surrender or starve. They decided to surrender, which is probably the smarter idea. Live to fight another day. Although if you watch a movie like Unbroken, I don't know if I would have wanted to survive in a Japanese prison camp. I think I would rather have fought to the death. It was very terrible what the Japanese made prisoners do. I had an uncle, I guess a great uncle, who fought in World War II and was a prisoner in a Japanese prison camp. And we joke about that whole penguin soup story. And if you don't know what that is, you can ask me some other day. But one day, my mom, of course this was my dad's uncle, so right after my mom and dad got married, she made one of her better dishes that people tend to really like to eat a lot. Cabbage rolls. It's basically a mixture of ground beef and rice and some seasonings, and then you wrap that into a partially cooked cabbage leaf to make a little football-shaped cabbage burrito, and then you pour tomatoes and tomato soup over top of it. I think they're terrifyingly disgusting. I hate even the smell of the things, the look of them, and the flavor is just putrid. But a lot of people think they're delicious and really love them. So Mom was proudly brought a casserole full of cabbage rolls, or pig in a blanket, is what the people on Mom's side of the family call them, to a picnic at Uncle, his name was Angelo, and they called him Unge. They brought it to Uncle Unge's house. He was married to Aunt Clara. And Mom brought them into the kitchen, set them on the counter. And Uncle Unge got one whiff of those cabbage rolls and walked out of the house and refused to return until they were gone. Because for the several years that he was in prison camp, the 3 years that he was in prison camp, or however long he was, with the Japanese, the only thing that they fed him was cabbage. Can you imagine? He wasn't mad at my mom, but she broke a rule that she didn't even know she was breaking, is you did not bring cabbage into their house. Along with that, of course, there was forced labor, prison-like accommodations, starvation. They were not clothed correctly, beatings, and other just terrible psychological warfare visited upon these soldiers. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur was in command. He was one of those God on a battlefield types. Nothing quite like God on a battlefield as a general, they always say. In 1936, on until the beginning of the war, he began to attempt to defend the Philippines from Japanese incursion. There were 70,000 Filipino fighters and 20,000 U.S. fighters in the Philippines, along with 250 aircraft, and a small U.S. fleet. It was a small fleet because most of the fleet was in Pearl Harbor, and much of that had been bombed out. Now, several ships in the fleet had not been bombed. They were away from the islands, and the Japanese missed them altogether, which is a truly humongous blessing that we didn't have to try to start our fleet from scratch after the Pearl Harbor, which was what the Japanese were trying to do when they bombed us. But, 250 aircraft and a small fleet. Aircraft was quickly destroyed by the Japanese bombers, probably on the ground, and the ships were destroyed 2 days later in a massive Japanese bombing. The Japanese troops landed on December 10th, 41 at Luzon, and then again on Japanese 27th at Lingayen Gulf, and then another force at Manila. Three forces converged and hit Manila and just bombed the living daylights out of the Philippines and Manila. To preserve the civilian population, MacArthur proclaimed that Manila was an open city, and he withdrew his troops on December 26, 41 to the Bataan Peninsula. Japan took Manila on January 2nd, 42, and fought on in the Bataan Peninsula until FDR ordered a withdrawal on March 11th, 42 at night. MacArthur swore to return and surrendered Bataan, and left on the 11th of March, 42. Bataan fought on for another month and finally surrendered on the 9th of April in 1942. 11,000 men on Corregidor Island, or in Corregidor, I think Corregidor is an island, were left alone to fight there after Bataan's surrender until May 6th, 42. The prisoners were then forced on a long march to prison camps. That march was so hostile, so primitive, so awful that anyone who fell out of line, who fell over, who got hungry, couldn't move anymore, was immediately bayoneted by the Japanese, and not shot, bayoneted, because they didn't want to waste a bullet on an American soldier. It's become known as the Bataan Death March. But Japanese soldiers were known for their cruelty throughout the war. But the Bataan Death March is a particularly cruel example of that. At the same time, the Japanese were also bombing British possessions in the Orient. Hong Kong was forced to surrender on Christmas Day, 1941. The city of Singapore fell on February 15th, 42. And the Japanese and Siamese took Burma and built a big transport called the Burma Road there. The Japanese forced the British from Mandalay, China, and the Japanese moved on through victory after victory in the Pacific. The American and Dutch fleets held off the Japanese in the East Indies until March 7th, 42. And the Japanese even bombed Australia, Darwin, Australia, on February 19th, 42. There were some U.S. victories, however, and the U.S. victories started in 42 on April 18th when a flyer named Jimmy Doolittle led a raid. He took 16 B-25 bombers. They launched from an aircraft carrier in the Pacific, and they hit Tokyo and other Japanese cities. Japanese was stunned and terrified because they never thought that there was any way that their main islands, the islands of Japan itself, could ever be open to attack or penetration by these American bombers. Of course, these American bombers had run out of fuel long before they even got to turn around and go back to their aircraft carrier. They were forced to land in China and fend for themselves. But the Japanese were so stunned and so terrified that they responded by extending their lines away from Japan and stretching out their forces to keep the U.S. away from the mainland of Japan. It's not really a mainland, it's a main island chain, but still. They ended up having to thin out their forces. Their massive military defenses, naval defenses around Japan were forced to stretch out. And this is what the American fleet and the British fleet took advantage of. They saw this as an opportunity to attack the Japanese fleets and wipe them out piecemeal rather than trying to put one massive battle after battle onto the Japanese mainland or onto the defenses that were swarmed around the Japanese mainland. Now that they were stretched out, we fought several battles, starting with the Coral Sea. This battle stopped the Japanese from invading New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Solomon Islands. It was the first naval battle in which no ships ever made contact. It was just planes launched off ships, fighting with each other and then landing back on their ships, refueling, resupplying, and then going back in the air. That was a U.S. victory. At Midway, which they just made a movie about a year ago, 100 Japanese ships, all 4 heavy carriers of Japanese and a heavy cruiser were sunk. This battle at Midway turned the tide of the war because much of the Japanese Navy was lost at Midway. At the Aleutian Islands, these are all islands in the Pacific, obviously, the Japanese bombed Dutch Harbor and occupied Attu, Kishka, and Agatu in the Aleutians. The Aleutians are close to Alaska. The Aleutians are close to Alaska, and by the spring of 1943, the Japanese had been driven out by American troops of the Aleutians. At Guadalcanal, on August 7th, 42, the Americans launched their counteroffensive. Now, the Japanese had been on the offensive this whole time, attacking in overwhelming force. But now that they were getting beat back and hurt, the American troops were able to launch a counteroffensive. U.S. Marines went on shore at Guadalcanal on the Solomon Islands, and the Japanese were reinforced. And that battle lasted from August 7th, 42 until sometime in February 1943. When the Japanese were finally overcome by the American troops. And then we began a policy, the U.S. troops began a policy of something we call island hopping. Island hopping is when we go from one island to the next, to the next, to the next. And we go from one island and we conquer the next island, move our base to the island we just conquered, and then attack the next island up. Conquer that island, move our base to that island, move on to the next island up. And we did that for the rest of the war until the war was over. We attacked the Marshall Islands in February 1st of 44, and we took those islands quickly. We attacked the Marianas Islands in June and July of 44. Saipan Island was the keystone of the Japanese defenses in the Marianas, and it actually put us in range of not only Japan, the islands of the main part of Japan, but also the Philippine Islands. We sunk 4 Japanese carriers, and they lost 400 planes at the Marianas. The U.S. took Guam and Tinian Island in July of 44 and were in control of the Marianas Islands. Then we began attacking Japan with bombing raids and destroyed Japanese war production. These bombing raids weren't just dropping bombs everywhere like Hitler did with the London Blitz. These were raids using whatever intelligence we could gather. These air raids were trying to destroy Japanese industry and war production, and it worked. By the end of the war, the Japanese soldiers had barely any ammunition. Most of them were ill supplied, starving, and just dying on their feet. And they still fought on. They were brutally dedicated soldiers. We fought in New Guinea in the summer of 42. MacArthur had a base at Port Moresby in New Guinea, and he slowly drove out the Japanese. The fanatical Japanese resistance, with few supplies, disease, heat, and humidity, fought on, and they were finally pushed out in the fall of 44. So it took over 2 years to push them out of New Guinea. The Philippines was MacArthur's next object. He promised to return, and when return he did. They began with massive airstrikes, and they crippled the Japanese Air Force and Navy. Then they began to land forces at several different islands. And I can't read my writing here. I think it says Peleliu and Morotai, and then Mindanao. Then we landed on Leyte Gulf, Leyte, Leyte Gulf, on October 19th and 20th in 44, and fought the Battle of Leyte Gulf. And MacArthur finished off the Japanese Navy and Air Force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf. On January 9th in 1945, we went ashore at Luzon in the Philippines, Lingayen Gulf, and Sabic Bay, and Nasugbu, I think it's pronounced. We landed paratroopers on Corregidor on February 17th, 45, and we freed Manila by the end of February 45, and MacArthur held his promise. They fought in Luzon until the end of the war, however. And now we embarked on our final drive to end the war. Several B-29 raids on Japanese industries, submarine attacks on Japanese shipping, and Japan's industry and war efforts were collapsing. There's an island called Sulphur Island, also known as Iwo Jima, and we fought for a month there in terrible, terrible fighting. From February 19th, 45 until March 17th, 45, 6,000 U.S. died, 20,000 Japanese died. I think this is the island from Hacksaw Ridge. Don't get me wrong, it could have been Okinawa, which is the next one we're talking about. The Japanese offered a desperate resistance there. 45,000 U.S. troops died. 5,000 Japanese bombers were loaded with, their nose cones were loaded with explosives, and the Japanese tried to fly those bombers loaded with explosives into the side of American ships in a suicide attempt to sink ships. Those were called kamikazes. 12,000 U.S. died in kamikaze attacks, 36,000 were wounded, and 100,000 Japanese ended up dead, grand total, on Okinawa. On April 12th, 1945, FDR finally passed away. He'd been quite ill for the last few years of the war, and I think it was strokes. Yeah, he died of a stroke. And it wasn't the first one he'd had. His health had just been worse and worse as the war wore on. He was succeeded by his vice president, of course, Harry S. Truman. The British, the United States, and Stalin met in a place called Potsdam, and they called for Japanese unconditional surrender at Potsdam. Now let's define unconditional surrender, because it's a term that's confusing. So I'm going to look it up and read you the definition off my phone. Unconditional surrender is a surrender in which no guarantees are given to the surrendering party. In modern times, unconditional surrenders most often include guarantees provided by international law. So yes, we would follow the laws set forth at the Geneva Convention for, civility in times of war, but we weren't going to offer them anything else. We weren't going to give them the islands back. We weren't going to give them any money. We weren't going to guarantee that to feed their troops. We weren't going to do anything for them. We just demanded that they surrender. And the Japanese refused surrender. They stood resolute. And Truman decided to use a new weapon, the nuclear bomb, which had been in production for many years in America. There's a whole day's worth of class that we could talk about the nuclear bomb, but it was developed in complete secret in a codenamed project called the Manhattan Project. It was developed in Los Alamos, New Mexico, and parts of Tennessee, and a little bit in the University of Chicago. But they discovered that by taking an atom and splitting it in half, it would release a tremendous amount of energy and would essentially cause a chain reaction with the other atoms around it and release an even larger amount of energy. And so we hired the greatest minds of the day to help us develop that into a weapon. And most of those great scientists were driven out of Europe by the Germans and Italians. Albert Einstein, Teller, Fermi, Oppenheimer were all transplants from Europe that we used to help develop this bomb. You have to have fissionable material, uranium P37 or something like that, heavy water, strange items that can actually have their atoms split. We launched the first atomic bomb on August 8th, 1945, and it had the power of 13,000 tons of TNT. 92,000 people were immediately killed, and the entire city of Hiroshima was destroyed. On the same day, the USSR declared war on Japan, and it was looking pretty grim. We were going to bomb another city close to Hiroshima, but the weather went bad, so we were forced 3 days later to drop a second bomb because the Japanese refused to surrender on the city of Nagasaki, which was a smaller target. August 9th, 1945, and 40,000 more people in Japan lay dead. Japan asked for terms of surrender on August 10th, 1845, and we call September the 2nd, 1945, VJ Day, or Victory in Japan Day.